Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us for this spARO pre-ARO midwinter meeting science communication workshop. So my name is Dana Bobinger, and along with Braulio Peguero, we're the spARO representatives who helped to organize today's workshop. And I'm delighted to introduce our two presenters today. So we have Matthew Wynn, who's professor of speech language hearing sciences at the University of Minnesota, and Kelsey Ann Buell, who's a postdoctoral fellow in the SANES lab at New York University. And so they have a great presentation prepared for you guys, and I will let Matthew get started. Thanks so much.
All right, here we go. All right, looks like you can see my screen, right? Yeah, confirm for me, Dana? Great.
Yes, yeah.
All right, we're gonna kick it off here. So Kelsey and I are really excited to share our thoughts with you today about science communication. This is a topic that is very rarely taught explicitly, and we're just kind of expected to learn things by watching others, but this is a skill that, like any other important skill, should be practiced very intentionally. There are mistakes and bad habits that all of us are guilty of. Today's presentation will be filled with tips and strategies you can use to more effectively communicate your work at conferences like ARO or any other meeting that you attend. This is really meant for scientist to scientist communication. A big part of this message is removing the clutter from your presentation and helping your audience find your message and remember your message. So first, we're going to go over some basic design tips for putting together your slides if you're giving a talk. We'll walk through some tips for guiding the viewer's attention, which works both for talks and for posters. We're going to give explicit tips for a poster presentation, not just designing it, but also notes about etiquette and strategy and handling questions and making sure you stay on time and on track. We're going to focus on figure design and data visualization and go over some ideas for creating and presenting figures that are accessible and inclusive for people who have hearing or vision difficulties as well. And finally, we'll wrap up the session with some bite-sized tips and thoughts on how to wrap up your presentation effectively. So we have a great reminder here from Mark Lewis about who's in charge of your presentation. If you find yourself skipping ahead to different slides or circling back and saying to your audience, oh, sorry, this doesn't make sense yet, but hang in with me, we'll get to this section soon. That means that your narrative isn't designed effectively. It means that the slides are controlling you, but you want to be the one controlling the slides. So I'm going to give you a good way to do this. First, you want to write down the essential pieces of your story first before making any slides. Then turn those pieces into slide titles and then use those titles to guide your talk structure. I'll show you what I mean by this. So remember to write out your real story, not just the methods, which is what a lot of us spend maybe too much time talking about, but the actual problem you're trying to solve. Here's the big picture. Here's the obstacle to overcome. Here's how we did it. Here's what we found. And I want to emphasize here that it's very difficult to do this if you're working on your slides directly, like in PowerPoint. You want to do this on a whiteboard with Post-it notes, with anything else that's very easy to move around and play with. Because if it's on your slides, it's going to start to create transitions that are hard to break. And you're going to create material that you become attached to. So you take these messages and you turn them into short sentences, okay? And then they become your slide titles. And then they're already in the right order because you've spent some time ordering them, and then you build the talk around those slides. And so this little piece of advice has a lot of different benefits to it, which I can show you here. The slide titles are very underused in talks. You'll notice the talk that you're viewing now will have titles that follow this principle of putting the main point directly on the slide as the title. The value here is that you don't just have the right ordering, but you also ensure that the audience gets the main takeaway point, as we can see here. So remember that the title is the biggest piece of text on the screen, and it would be a shame if you didn't make it do some work for you. So notice what we have here on the left. This is what we usually see, results, but that title doesn't do anything for you. It tells you nothing. So we can use that big text on the screen and actually use it to give a message. In this case, slower speaking rate reduces listening effort. So On the right, the slide title ensures that the audience gets the main takeaway point and doesn't require them to sort of read into the smaller text on the slide. Okay, so all of these things are just sort of very overview about how to design a talk. One more thought here I'll share before I turn it over to Kelsey. Some of you might have heard, classical advice that's something like prepare for 1 slide per minute. And that's a decent place to start, but it only works if your slides are like a script that has, where you just read things in order. I would encourage you instead to think of how many ideas per minute that you need to present, because you might sequence a set of slides that progress very incrementally and you can fly through 12 slides in 30 seconds and might spend a lot of time unpacking a figure on 1 slide. And you can sort of imagine this going both ways. So think about how many ideas you need to fit into your time. And with those things in mind, Kelsey's going to talk about how to make really good use of the space you have on your slide. So I'm going to turn it over to her now.
All right, thank you, Matt. Okay, so let me share my screen. Okay, let me know if you can't see that.
Looks good.
Thank you. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Kelsey. Matt, thank you for introducing the workshop and kind of going over the main goals of what we want to do today, and also going over some basics of putting together a talk and thinking about your titles and the actual content that you put on a talk. And so what I'm going to start off with is, a lot of times we think about what figures we want on the talk, things like that, but sometimes we don't really think about the actual text that we're going to put on your slide. And so when you put text on your slide, you really want it to be helpful for your audience. And you don't want to put things that are, broad themes that are very unhelpful for your audience. And so what I mean by that is, I'll walk through an example to show you what I mean. Okay, so here's an example of someone throwing up a statement on their slide, and it says the robustness of speech perception. So this is kind of a general idea, a theme, but it's not really helpful for your audience, especially if you then follow it up with a list of citations. And so I think we're all kind of guilty of putting a slide together like this, but really these are notes to yourself. They are not very helpful for your audience. What would be better is to make a statement that is informative, and instead of listing a list of citations, maybe change the way you present those citations. So the way that I would redo the slide is to then say something like, speech perception is robust to many signal distortions. Instead of listing a bunch of citations, you do list them, but the more important thing is, what do these citations actually bring to the table? So if you then list them based off of what each citation is actually showing and how it supports your informative statement, that is much more helpful for the audience. So instead of notes to yourself, these are more notes to the audience. Another thing I want to point out here is note the ordering. So these are ordered in a very intentional way. So I've ordered these based from easiest to understand to more abstract topics. That also makes it more accessible to your audience as well. Another thing I want to point out is I do have the citations here, and they are there for people who want to look deeper into the topic, but they're de-emphasized. And I de-emphasize them by making the font a little smaller, kind of graying it out a little bit in order to emphasize the main topic that each citation brings. Okay, so right now I'm going to talk about mainly tips for giving a talk. So how do you guide the viewer's attention as you give a talk? And this is a really challenging thing to do, because how do you ensure that each member of the audience is looking where you want them to look and also thinking about what you want them to think about? So if you put up a slide and you have a lot of information on there, it's going to be really hard for your audience to look and follow along with what you're trying to say. There are some really helpful tips that can help with guiding the viewer to help follow along with your message. And some of these tips are really simple. So one thing that's really, really helpful is to show the information in pieces and show them as you talk, as you convey your message. So when you say one point, show the figure or the data piece that corresponds to that point. When you move on to the next point, then show the next one. And so this really helps your audience follow along. Another really helpful tip is to directly point or circle to a specific thing that you want to focus on. And so I really encourage you to utilize the circles, shapes, whatever shape you want, or arrows. I really encourage you to do that over using a laser or a pointer, because ultimately, when you use a laser or use your mouse cursor, it can be a little distracting. If you use circles, it can be much more to the point. Another really effective tip is to dim the background around the point of interest. So maybe you don't want to get rid of everything on the slide. You want to keep it up there. But one way to do that is just dim it so that you can de-emphasize the background in order to emphasize the point you want to focus on. Another thing is try to avoid clutter. If you're not going to talk about something on a slide, then don't include it. Really try to only show things that you are going to talk about. Okay, so putting all of that together, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to walk through an example of how I would take a figure from a paper, maybe that I want to talk about it in the beginning of my talk. And I'm going to show you how I incorporate all of these different tips to really make it an effective way to guide your viewers' attention as you present the figure. So here's an example figure from a paper that I've used in, that I've incorporated in previous talks. And right now, I have just taken a screenshot from the figure and I put it on the slide. And so right now, I'm sure all of you are kind of darting around, you're not sure where to look, you're looking at the labels, you're looking at the data. And this is not ideal, because I'm going to be walking through the figure, but you're not really going to be listening to what I'm going to say. So the first thing I would do is I would try to identify the most important finding from that figure. If I'm not going to talk about everything, then don't show it. In this particular case, I want to talk about 4 different things on this figure. Once I've identified those important findings, then I'm going to eliminate everything else because I'm not going to talk about it. Another really helpful thing is don't feel like you have to keep the figure as is just because it's published and it's not your work, or maybe it's from a different lab. It's okay to reorganize the figure in order to help you better present the figure. So in this case, I'm reorganizing it. And when possible, try to make it bigger so that the audience can see all of the data points and the text. Another thing that's really helpful is don't feel like you have to use the existing labels that came with the figure. I really encourage you to eliminate all of the old labels and try not to have any abbreviations. Try to write out everything so that you don't have to make the audience work harder than they have to. In this particular case, I relabeled all of the labels. I've also added titles. I've written out all of the abbreviations. I've used different colors. Now, as it looks right now, it's still a lot. So the next tip, which is, I think, the most important thing, is introduce the panels sequentially as I talk about them. So in this particular case, maybe I'm going to start with the timeline of my this particular experiment. Then I'll go over the what the timeline is for that particular condition or experimental manipulation. Then I show the data that corresponds to that particular condition. Then if I want to talk about maybe a second experimental group, I'll then go back to the timeline. I'll introduce the second experimental group. Then I'll show the data that corresponds to that second experimental group. So even though I've kind of pared it down quite a bit from the original figure, by introducing each of these panels sequentially, it really helps you follow along with what I'm trying to say. And something I really love to do is to fade out everything that is not of importance, especially if I want to focus on one group over another. So in this case, I want to focus on the panel on the left. So I've emphasized that by de-emphasizing everything else. Okay, so those are all tips for helping you think about the text content of your slides when you give a talk, and also think about how you might walk someone through something really complicated, such as a really complicated figure. And so now what Matt is going to do is he's going to talk about some great ideas for designing your figures. So I'll hand it over to Matt.
Okay, here we are. All right, so there's a wide variety of different kinds of visualizations that someone can use. And this is just scratching the surface, even though there's already a lot on the screen. You can imagine a large catalog. In fact, there's a website called DataViz Catalog that lists out a bunch of different visualizations, and you might use this even before conducting a study or conducting your analysis, just to open up your imagination about the way data can be presented, because you might find that one of these is really suited for the kind of data that you have. There's another great website called data2viz.com, which has a great flow chart that helps you make a good decision, again, based on the nature of the data you have. You'll find at any conference you go to an abundance of bar charts. And sometimes bar charts aren't the most effective way of showing your data. So it's good to just be very knowledgeable about the options available so that when the right time comes, you can go into that toolkit. Okay, here's the strategy I recommend, which works for most plots, not all of them, but for a lot of plots. The strategy is to first talk about the x-axis, then the y-axis, show one data point, and then show the data pattern. And I'll show you an example here. And this is an example of investing the time, slowly explaining one plot so that when it comes time to show the full data set, the audience is prepared to understand what you're talking about. Okay, so we have a plot here, and on the x-axis we see frequency mismatch, which means that the frequency is either lower or higher than the target frequency. And on the y-axis, we have the listener's judgment about if the pitch sounds flat or sharp. And the y-axis will be easier to read if the text were horizontal, so you want to look for opportunities to do that whenever possible. Now I want to tell you what to look for. So down here, we have a negative frequency mismatch, and that means the frequency is lower than you expect, and you should hear that as flat. That's why the point is there. And if the frequency mismatch is higher, you should say it's sharp. And if the frequency is directly perfect, you should judge it right in the middle of the scale. So this would indicate good performance. Your responses go from bottom left to top right, as opposed to bad performance, which looks like this red line, which is when even if the frequency is higher or lower than it should be, you still think it's just fine either way. So this means that you can't really hear the difference between the different frequencies. So good performance looks like this. The dots sort of form a diagonal line. It has a little bit of a sigmoid shape, but the point is that the line goes in that direction and has that slope to it. So it took me a minute to walk through this whole plot, but now that I've gotten here, I trust that when I show you a more complicated plot, that you'll understand it and that you'll know what to look for and how to interpret what you see. So for example, because of that walkthrough, the audience is probably noticing these lines here in the middle because those are the ones that I've shown you mean bad performance. And this is important because you could be noticing all other kinds of details on the slide, right? You can notice that the blue lines are a little bit to the left, but I didn't really introduce that as an important point, right? I introduced the important point as like the range, the rate of change of that slope of that line. So notice again here, just as Kelsey was alluding to before, I'm using a little transparent object in the PowerPoint to highlight this section and not using a laser pointer, not just because it's Zoom, but because laser pointers are always really jiggly and not very pleasing to look at, and you might as well use something directly on the screen. So whenever you have a plot, you want to think of ways to make it easier for the audience. And I actually want to pose a little exercise for you in the audience right now. Looking at this plot, type in the chat window, what would you do to this plot to make it better? So I'm going to give you a minute to type in your thoughts. I'm going to monitor our chat. A lot of people pointing out that you want the points to be bigger for sure. The possibility of connecting lines, which we'll talk about. Lines on the axes, larger text, presenting things sequentially rather than all at once. So one thing here that I want to address right away, actually, I'll address it in just a moment here. Let's walk through some of the different things we can do to this plot here. So first, in every situation, try to make the text larger and try to think of ways that you can have the audience avoid darting their eyes around to look for things. So where I'm going to begin here is just with a blank plot. Okay. And I want to think about this plot as giving you a specific comparison, right? The comparison here is between the control group and the treatment group. So I'll start with a blank plot. I'll take away the background image. And first, I'm just going to show you the control group. Here's where we're starting. This is the first half of the comparison. Then I'll give you the second half of the comparison. Okay. And now that we're here, again, you can type right into the chat here. What else would you change about this plot? We've made the text bigger. We've made the points bigger. I've shown things one at a time. Okay. Now, what other things do we think we might want to change? There's an idea here in the chat about describing the scale on the axis. So you want units, right? So our y-axis just says score. Is that a percent? Is that a count of something, right? There's description of what the treatment might be, which might go really into a figure caption, right? We might not know what the groups is, right? So without a caption, that's hard to see. And these are just, made up data anyway. Okay. So there's making sure the audience knows the units and what's being counted. So let's go back to this. All right. So what I've done here is chosen different colors that have better contrast. Okay, so going back to this one, both of these colors have about the same level of darkness. And if you didn't have very good color vision, it might be difficult. Now we have a solid black one and a lighter one, which is blue. But notice how the ordering of the legend doesn't match the ordering of most of the data. So I'm going to change the order of the legend so that it matches the order in the data. Okay, just as one little subtle helper. Okay, it's not always possible to do that because sometimes your data go in different directions. But when you do have that situation, it's a good little trick. Now, what I've done here is pretty subtle. I've changed which shape goes with which data point. We expect the treatment to give you a higher score. So I've made that one the triangle, which almost looks like a little up arrow, like it has moved up from the control group. And I can also annotate these with lines, which were suggested by some people in the chat. Now notice what I'm doing here, though, is that the lines are connecting the data that are related to each other. So within the same group, within group B, I'm connecting the control and treatment groups, but I'm not drawing lines between all the different circles, right? Because that would, because these are nominal groups, right? So you want to know when it's appropriate to use lines. And in this case, it's not appropriate to use horizontal lines because there's no actual ordered mathematical sequencing of these groups. They're just named groups. Okay, and now I can highlight those features. And in some cases, there's still more that you can add here. All right, so you might think, well, what are we trying to get out of this plot? We want to know how much better the treatment is compared to the control. And I might directly label the amount of improvement we see in each group. Okay. And if this is the only thing you're going for, then you might just produce a plot that simply has the improvement, right? So there are different reasons you might choose the plot on the left or the right. Now, the plot on the left is maybe less visually appealing, but it is more direct if what you're interested in is just the improvement score. So a lot of times we'll start to make a plot, we'll start to improve it, add little details, and get really attached to it, even if it's not the plot that most directly conveys the information we want. So we want to make sure we're keeping that in mind, because the point of this plot is to reduce effort for the audience as they understand our work. Okay, so another little exercise here. Here's a plot whose legend could be improved a little bit. Okay, so here's, by the way, an example from Klaus Wilke's book, Fundamentals of Data Visualization. Here, what we're doing is we're changing the legend to follow the order of the data, but you can still change this to make it a little bit easier, right? Because whenever you have a legend, you're asking the viewer to look back and forth between the data and the plot, right? So instead, we can just directly label the end of the lines, and now no legend is even needed, right? So whenever you have an opportunity to do this, you should think about considering that. Occasionally you don't have lines, you just might have a lot of points. And to distinguish those points, like if all these points represented different people, we might use a color scheme. But again, some of these colors are hard to distinguish. You ask the audience to look back and forth. And this could actually get kind of annoying as an audience member, especially because we give people such little time to look at plots. So first, the colors. Now, your first thought might be to turn these into shapes, right? But these, again, ask the audience to look back and forth between the plot and the legend. So in any situation, it could be a plot that you're working on now, or a plot that is from a paper that has been published for 25 years, you can think about what you would change about the plot. And in this case, one easy change we could make is to use direct labeling again. Now, we already had these same labels, A through G, already for the data, but now we don't have to look back and forth to compare them. And here's just an example of reducing effort for the audience. One more thing we can do to be a little bit more intentional about our design is to think about setting up the plot, then showing the data, right? So I can talk about what these axes mean and what it means to test for logic, phonetics, pragmatics, these categories, and what the score means. If I show the data right away, people will start to think about those data and maybe aren't really listening to what I'm trying to say. So it could be a way of just pacing the audience to make sure they get the information you need. But in this case, there are still more things that we can change about this plot. So you might want to make the points bigger. You might want to consider your color scheme. But something that's a little bit more basic than that is to think about the ordering, right? So sometimes you have a very obvious ordering, like day 1, day 2, day 3. You have to put those in order, right? But these categories don't have any inherent order. They're just alphabetical, which is how most software will plot it. If I intentionally order them in the order of the scoring, this becomes a little bit easier to read and easier to annotate as well. So I can say training helps syntax and logic. Training doesn't really help phonetics and pragmatics. And now I can organize my plot very simply. I mentioned before about, speaking of text, that you should try to make text horizontal when you can. Okay, and here's an example of a plot that has a lot of text and long labels for things. And so what I did to this plot, which just shows, the prevalence of incorrect definitions of statistical significance in a textbook, is to just turn it all horizontal. Okay, so now it's easier to read and you can actually fit a lot more things, a lot more categories. It takes up less space and allows me some room to add a little annotation about this. So we have no legend needed, fewer access markers, and horizontal text. Another thing I'm trying to do here is use the colors to guide your attention to things. So any kind of contrast, whether it's color or shape or angle, can be used to guide the audience attention. So Kelsey talked about this before in terms of when you're setting up a plot to show things sequentially, to make sure everyone's looking where you want them to look. If you're creating a static plot, you don't have that element of time, but there are still really good strategies you can use. And now I'm going to borrow one from Storytelling with Data, which is a great service, as well as a book that Cole Nussbaumer and Affleck has written. Some really, really excellent content that I encourage everyone to check out. So this is an example from her book, where here's an example plot. We're comparing, let's call it our business to our other competitors. And these are the data, right? And the color is not really doing much for us because the color doesn't make our business stand out, and the ordering doesn't really do it for us either. It's pretty hard to follow any pattern here, even though the data are all there for us. So we strip away the color, and now I'm going to highlight where I want you to look, which is the data for our business. And I can make this even easier by making our business always the first one listed. Okay, so now you don't have to sort of search through where it falls. And now when I introduce that color, it really stands out. Now, these are the data, and there's no axis on here, just because it's an example. But if we wanted you to know just generally where the data fall, this is sufficient. If you want to know the exact number, you can annotate that right on the plot. Sometimes it's important for your audience to know just the general trend, and other times it's actually important for them to know the real specific number. You want to ask yourself which situation you're in. You don't always need the exact number. Sometimes you just need to know this one's always higher than that one, and that's all you need to know. But here, what I'm highlighting is the ordering within a category and the ordering of categories, because the ordering between categories shows us, okay, at the top of the graph, that's where our business is doing really well. The bottom of the graph, that's where we're not doing well. And we can see that even within the categories. One last example here, in terms of the different kinds of charts you might want to use. Again, bar charts are used all the time, okay? And this is what we call dodged bars. So each category has bars that are sort of grouped together. And we can compare a lot of things, but it's easiest to compare things that are next to each other without any intervening clutter, right? Without any intervening data points. So this makes that actually pretty difficult. I can compare things within category, not easily compare things across category. So if I turn this into a line chart, now I can compare each color across the x-axis, and I can also compare each color within the same column as well. So it would be useful to use this line because the x-axis SNR here is actually a numerical variable. So it makes sense to connect these with a line. It wouldn't make sense if I put the categories, the skills here, main idea, vocabulary, details, reasoning, they shouldn't really be connected because there's no ordering. But when you have an ordering, a line chart can do a lot of work for you. Okay. So I want to pause here and open up the floor for any questions or comments that we have. The next segment that we have is to talk about poster design and poster delivery, but I don't want to rush right into that. I want to give a moment to check the chat window and see if people have any questions or comments that they want to share. And also, Kelsey, if you want to hop in, if you have anything you want to add in, feel free to do that too. A topic that will come up later is the idea of actually giving people time enough to form a question, which sometimes take a little time.
I have just a general question, or it looks like there's one in the chat. Maybe we can do that one first and you can come back to me.
Sure, yeah. Jane is asking for our favorite platforms for creating figures and presentations. I create all my figures using ggplot2, using R. And the reason I do that is that it makes it very easy to think about plots in layers. And as I was doing before, and as Kelsey was doing before, to show little bits of a plot in layers turns out to be a pretty good strategy for helping people walk through it piece by piece. And then I also use PowerPoint for my presentations. I think that PowerPoint has some limitations, but the more you learn about what's available in it, it can be quite powerful. And I can use it to make figures. I can use it to dim out backgrounds. I can use it to sequentially show things. Those are, yeah. Dana, what do you think?
Oh, I was just going to ask whether you think all of these sorts of tips that you've provided here are sort of more for PowerPoint presentations or for paper figures, or whether you see there being sort of a right place for all of these things, or whether this is just in general good advice that people should use for making all different kinds of figures.
I think that what I just recently talked about would be good advice for any figure, especially leveraging contrast and being familiar with different types of visualizations and some general rules about when it's right to use lines, when to, making sure that your bar graph has a 0 on it and doesn't sort of start in the middle of your range to make it not misleading, things like that. What Kelsey talked about before, I think, is really a little bit more specific for talks when you have an opportunity to change what a person sees. What do you think, Kelsey? Anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think kind of addressing the first question about what's my favorite thing to use. I think similar to Matt, I use PowerPoint to actually make the presentations. And I use a lot of the features of PowerPoint, like inserting a transparent white box to kind of dim things in the background. That's how I do that. But as far as making the figures themselves, a lot of times I'll make them initially in MATLAB and then I'll export it and I'll make it pretty in Illustrator. So that's what I use as well. And as far as all of these great ideas that Matt has for what types of figures, I agree that all of these concepts are really can be extended to any type of figure, whether it's in a paper or a poster or a talk. I think with posters and talks, you have a little bit more freedom with how many helpers you add to the plot. That being said, I think when you publish a figure, it should still be really helpful as well. So.
Yeah, and there's some other things here in the chat. So Madhuri, so I think your question was Kelsey addressed here. So if you're using PowerPoint, you can create, let's say, a white box that just goes over something and just make it partially transparent, as Kelsey was saying. For Satyabrata, I don't have any opinions about not using a grid for a plot. In some journals, you'll have specifications where they'll tell you to not use a grid. I think if you're gonna have a grid, as you see on the screen here, to make it very light. I like grids, but not everyone does. I don't really have opinions about that, which is unusual for me. So Celia is asking about plotting several subjects' data in the same plot, using different markers or uniform color. Any other tips? So I think for this question, the question I always pose is it important for you to know which participant produced which data point? If so, then you have to think really carefully about how you can identify those data points. If instead you want to show that there is distribution, then I make them all uniform color. I make them sort of lighter lines, let's say light gray lines with the overall average plotted big and darker in front of it. So that it really depends on whether you need to recover a specific identity for the data point, I would say. There's a lot of really good tutorials for ggplot and the Tidyverse website. I don't really have any opinions about titles. Jennifer was asking about that. Sometimes I find that titles aren't really used that often in journals, but that's maybe just for my field. Kelsey, I don't know if that's different for your sub area.
Right. I think in published figures, I don't see titles too often, but I think when you're giving a talk or a poster, I think having titles it's really helpful, especially if maybe, let's be honest, sometimes our attention drifts in and out when we're listening to a talk and maybe someone said what the main point of a figure was, but you missed it and you don't know what the main point is. But if you have a title explicitly written, then you can easily kind of catch back up. And as far as the grid idea, I think grids can be very helpful, especially if they are muted in gray, so they're not kind of overtaking the actual data itself. I think they can be really helpful if, let's say, you have an axis and then maybe the data point is far away from the axis, and it's really hard to make comparisons, especially if you're comparing two data points that are close together and you actually want to know what the values are. I think sometimes if you have a long horizontal reference line, that can be really helpful in those cases. But
Yeah.
I think it really depends on the figure.
Yeah, I agree. So it looks like the questions are slowing down a little bit. So I'm going to move on to our content on presenting posters. I'll call that up here. All right. And thanks everyone for chiming in and offering your thoughts and asking questions. That makes it a lot more fun for us to do too. So I'm going to talk about preparing a poster, give some basic advice on designing the poster, and then advice on, for lack of better word, etiquette or strategy. So these are three very different components, right? So preparation, what I mean is, before you even make your poster, what are the things you're thinking about? And I want you to consider really slowing down and thinking about your real goals, because sometimes you really want to introduce a topic and get people's feedback on it. Sometimes your goal is to actually deliver the actual data, right? Sometimes your goal is just to introduce yourself to people and meet people and let them know how you think, or maybe to look for a job. And so there are different kinds of goals for different posters, and they might change depending on the conference you're presenting at. So you definitely want to plan your introductory narrative before designing your poster, just like we said before about talks. So a lot of planning should go in before you really start building your material. I suggest this to people in my lab, to always begin with a sequence of sentences like this. In this study, we're interested in this. We think it's important because of that. Here's a quick example of what I mean, just to make sure you understand. And here's what we know. But then there's this other factor. Therefore, we have to do this study, or therefore we expect this result. So that only took me like a minute or so, but you can imagine that this could really set the stage clearly for someone. And this is usually the part of the presentation that people skip over, unfortunately, but it's the most important. So here's an example. We're interested in a situation where you misperceive a word, but then make a guess based on what you think it probably was. So the original version of this was, we're interested in whether the Ganong effect changes with different degrees of spectral resolution. Woof. So like there's a lot of jargon in there, and like who knows why this is relevant, right? So going back to the workshopped version, right? This is a lot more accessible, and it makes it seem like, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. And then where does this lead? This is a very relatable problem. Usually we jump right into the methods because that's when we spend most of our time, and we get really attached to it because we put so much work into it. We want to be recognized for that technical work we do, but that's not necessarily what the audience needs, especially at the introduction of a presentation. So you want to design your narrative and then build the poster. So Fabricio Plamplona has a really good materials on Science Talk, the Science Talk website, and suggests 5 different actions before you even create the layout of your poster, which I think exemplifies exactly the kind of advice that we're giving today. So you can recall situations, either yourself or being at someone else's poster, where a person jumps around to different parts of the poster as if they didn't really plan it with their presentation in mind. So, they might start at the introduction, but then sort of jump over to the results or jump over to the methods, and then back to the participant section, and then over to this other figure, and they're jumping all the way around. And you can kind of tell that maybe they designed the poster and only then thought about how they were going to present it. So I'm going to give you some ideas about how you might design your poster so that it flows with a little bit more clarity. The first thing is about visual appeal and setting landmarks for where you're going to hit. These will create flow. And then some smaller tactics like showing rather than telling, okay? Coordinating different components of your poster like color schemes, and then little tips for helping the reader along. So we're going to start broad and then get into some details. The first pretty basic idea, as you think about this poster, all of you are probably having kind of a similar reaction. And it should be familiar that you can think of this as like a big wall of text for the most part. And we want to avoid that, but usually people don't actually set that goal into motion. Now, something that's a little bit less intuitive is that a wall of figures could be just as uninviting as a wall of text, okay? So we have this wall of text, I see all that stuff, or I have a wall of figures and I think, oh no, this is gonna take forever to walk through. I don't think I have the time for this. So what I wanna set up in your mind is the idea of thinking from the audience's perspective, right? This poster design is from my perspective, like, oh, I wanna show you all this work I did, right? Look how proud I am. Look at how much data I have. But that's not necessarily what the audience needs from you, right? From the audience's perspective, I have a lot of posters I want to see. I know I don't need all those details to learn about what you're doing. And I don't want to be rude and like walk away in the middle. And so I might just skip your poster. If I think you're going to take 20 minutes to walk through every figure, I might not even start the conversation, right? So imagine that someone's in this situation. You want to design your poster in a way that will invite them to come speak with you and think, oh, this is going to be a good conversation that's not going to go off the rails. So one strategy we can have here is to break up those walls of text. So here's how we started, okay? And then ultimately we're working through different versions of this poster and realized we wanted to set some text off and make sure it was a landmark. And then other kinds of text, instead of just describing it, we tried to illustrate it, okay? Here's something we illustrated where we had a stimulus design. We had a precursor and then a target. And then what the participant did was click one of these two options, ga or da, and then we multiplied this by 10 and then multiplied that by 4 to give you a sense of the block structure. So that was a whole experiment description, but it's like taking up a small amount of space and it's organized in a way that I can sort of walk along it. And I've ordered it in a way that the way that I would talk about it. Here's what you did in one trial. You did that kind of trial 10 times. And then there were 4 blocks of those groups. Zooming back out to the sort of visual appeal of the poster, you want to create easy targets for someone's eyes. So in this case, you see these little bubbles. It's a little bit more interesting than just having a list of things, right? These are 3 different components that I'll be talking about. And I want to let ideas flow between panels. I have this one bubble here that's set out into a different color, and that actually leads us into the next part of the poster. I'm going to talk more about context. And I'll have an easy example to make sure I don't have to think of one on the spot, right? So a lot of times we have, a concept is very familiar to us, but when asked for an example, we kind of pause for a moment and have to think about one, and it's kind of awkward. If you put the example right on your poster, it just helps you out and helps the audience as well. What I'm doing here is showing rather than telling. So the times that you want to show instead of tell include some of these things, and you can think of other opportunities as well. For diagramming a stimulus, diagramming what the interface looked like for your experiment. Did you have a screen that a person was clicking a button on? Did you have a camera? Did you have a maze that an animal was running through? You can show that instead of describing it. So here I have 2 different sound frequency spectra, and there are a lot of things I'm doing here. One, I'm not showing the real spectrum because it's so complex. I'd rather show this sort of schematized cartoon version of it, because all I want you to see is that there's a boundary for her voice in between the red and the blue sounds. There's a boundary for his voice between the red and the blue sounds, but those boundaries are at different spots or at different frequencies, okay? And that's all I need you to know. So if I put the real spectra on there, there'll be so many other details that they might distract your attention, okay? The other thing I'm doing is showing, I'm not just saying woman's voice, man's voice. I'm showing a woman, I'm showing a man, right? And it's just a little easier, okay? And I'm showing, cool people on the plot. So I can show where the stimuli go. If I have a binaural experiment, this goes to the left ear, this goes to the right ear. If you find yourself using your hands to gesture around, make it an image instead. It's probably going to be easier. If I want to diagram a trial timeline, first there was a beep, and then you saw a screen that had a red cross on it. Then you heard a sentence, and then this happened. Instead of me talking that out loud, instead of me just listing it with text, I have this little infographic here, which makes it easier for a person to really understand what happened. And becomes, a little bit more accessible. So there are all kinds of situations where you want to show rather than tell. We talked before about making sure you have good consistency and good flow of your ideas. So here's an example where I'm using color to make sure that my commentary goes with the data point that I want it to go with, okay? But I want you to think critically about ordering again, right? Because notice here I have data, I have a legend, and I have text. In the data go red, blue, then black. The legend goes black, blue, then red. And then the text just has blue and red. So there's a little inconsistency here. What I want to do is, the simplest thing is just to change the order of the legend. Now everything has the same order, and now I've aligned things so that it flows directly with the legend. The other thing you're seeing here is that I'm being very direct in interpreting the data for you. Okay, so I'm telling you, there's a cognitive cost to repairing misperceived words, right? There's no way that you'll miss that point because it's huge, right? I'm directly telling you, here's what the interpretation of that data plot is. And I do this as often as I can with data plots, right? Here I'm saying, look, here's what we know from this. And then I'm pointing to how we know it. Here's what we know, here's how we know it. Right, by pointing directly to it. If I just list these in a separate results section or a separate conclusion section, the audience might think, well, how did you come to that conclusion? Like where in the data do you find that? In this situation, I'm pointing exactly to which data point supports my point. In some cases, you have plots that are more complicated than this, right? And you might consider having a plot that just says, this is how you read the plot before you get into the data, right? So in the top panel, so this is just in my field, people are very familiar with the top row, but maybe not so familiar with the bottom row. So I'm telling them, here's how we're transforming the data so that you know how to recognize a small effect versus a large effect. That way, when you see this more complicated version of it, I've walked you through how to interpret that. But I'm also avoiding things that make your life difficult. I'm not going to use these abbreviations. I'm going to write out what I mean. Abbreviations are for you. The full name is for the audience, right? So we almost always have enough space to put that in. And if you don't feel like you have enough space, you still probably do. So avoid those initialisms, acronyms, abbreviations. They can be tricky for the audience. And if you must use them to save space, maybe accompany with a little image, right? So one of the reasons why this is important is that if you use an abbreviation later in the plot, over here on the right side, suppose someone doesn't remember exactly what that means. What are they going to do? Well, they might remember it, but more likely they're going to have to sort of look for the actual definition. They might not stop you though, right? Because different people have different amounts of comfort for what they want to stop you to do. So they might look directly at where you first defined it. That's not likely though. If you could remember exactly where it was, you might just remember it. Instead, what they'll probably do is sort of meander around the poster and look for where it was. And in the time that it takes to do that, you might have already gone on to the next point you want to make and you've lost them. They might just give up, like, oh, I'm just not going to worry about this. Or maybe they know where it is, but they can't see it because you're in front of your poster presenting it. So this is not really a problem for virtual posters for this year, but you'll probably go on to present many more posters in person, right, in the future. And so just keep in mind that if, as you're standing in front of the poster, a person might be trying to find something that you're standing in front of. So this gets us to the next point, which is just about how you deliver the poster. I'm going to start out with something that's a little bit more like etiquette here. And this is how to invite someone to your poster. And again, this is going to be a little different for remote conferences versus in-person conferences. I prepared this to be in-person advice because we just learned a couple of days ago that ARO is going to be remote, but this will be advice you can carry forward in the future. I want to encourage you to think about a low stakes introduction. Here's what I mean by that. You can ask questions like, do you want to hear about my poster? Could I give you a tour? Are you interested in context effects? But imagine that the person wants to say no. These are okay introductions, but there's a lower stakes version of this, which is, let me know if you'd like me to answer any questions or to give you a tour of the poster. So imagine the person just wants to sort of get a quick view, think about whether they're interested, and if they're not, they can move on. You can answer no to this question because maybe you don't have any questions. And then you can move on and there's no awkwardness, right? But if you don't want to see the poster, this is, imagine the person wants to say, oh, I'm just going to read through myself. There could be many reasons a person wants to do this, right? Maybe the person has hearing difficulty and it's a noisy conference hall, and it would be frustrating to try to converse when it's easier to read. Maybe they just want to ask you about how you made your stimuli, and they don't want the whole description of the project. They just want to ask you something that they want your advice on. Or they're familiar with the study, but they have a specific question and they don't need the whole story. They just have a short sentence they want to converse about. Or they want to talk to you about your career or their career. Maybe they want to ask some questions about your department because they want to work there. So poster sessions are for many reasons. So imagine that this is what a person's really after, but you asked, do you want to hear about my poster? What are they going to say? Well, they might be polite and just say yes, even though they don't really want to hear it, and they're kind of fidgeting as they're listening to you. So think about other kinds of ways you can invite someone to your poster that gets them that serves their actual need. You will ingratiate yourself. They will like you and they will remember you. And then, as the conversation flows, you'll probably still get to talk about your work. Part of this is making sure you don't give the audience details that they don't really want. And this can go right back to your design. So here's a poster I presented just last month, where my main path of where I walked people through was the top half of the poster, and then the bottom half had all these other details only for people who really wanted them, right? So here's where I put things like the statistical model parameters, details about the data. If I change this one thing, here's a subset of the data. If I had exact numbers for specific results, not everybody needs the raw numbers. So I went through the main path, got the main points across, and for most people, that was sufficient. But 1 out of every 10 people was super interested. And then for them, I went into those details and I really got into it. We talked about those details and they were really entertained by that. But for the most part, people will just be satisfied with the main story, and then you can let them follow up, because then they have a sense of a little bit of control, a little agency over the experience. So give the visitor a chance to say, oh yeah, I actually want those details. Or, yeah, okay, I got it. And thank you. And then they can, let you talk with other people. So you want to set up your design so that you can do this. Here's one way of doing that. I'll show you from an older poster. In the first draft of this poster, there were no landmarks to help someone quickly follow along with where to go. In a later draft, we put these specific landmarks on here that were set off in colored text boxes, so that if I just had 1 minute to tell the story, here's the points I would hit. Here's the problem, here's how we tested it, here's the conclusion, and here's what we think is the next question, right? And for a lot of people, that was a really good experience, and they wanted to know more, and then they could follow up with what they wanted to know. So it's just, recognizing that not every person wants every detail. A really good way of making sure you can do this is to practice different versions of your poster. So if you remember just one thing about this segment of our seminar today, It's to practice different versions. The full version, let's say 8 minutes of walking through your poster, all the details. Practice a 3-minute version. Practice a 1-minute version. As you're practicing with your group, go through it all, and then someone in the group says, okay, now do it in 3 minutes. And you try to do it in 3 minutes, and you'll probably struggle the first few times as you think about which parts are really necessary. And then once you have that, do it in 1 minute. This is for two main reasons. One, you want to make sure you can cater to people who have different amounts of time and different amounts of interest. But also, you'll find yourself needing to catch people up, right? Because not everyone gets the story from the beginning. So if you imagine that you're stopping at different points, you can catch people up with the shorter version. So after every section in your poster, you want to make sure that they're understanding what you're saying. So you can actually ask questions like, are you with me? Does this make sense so far? And actually pause to let them respond, okay? And this is just a reminder that the poster is not really for you to get through, right? You don't want to sort of set it in motion and just bulldoze your way through. Your goal is for the visitor to understand your work, okay? So I've been talking for a little while. I'm going to talk a little bit more about posters, but I want to check our chat window here as well to see if anyone has any thoughts or comments that they want to add to this, or things that they want to make sure that we address before we move on from this section. The next thing I'm going to talk about is staying on track and handling questions and handling different timing of when visitors walk up, just to give you a little preview. Checking our chat window here to see if people have any comments or questions or points that we want to touch on. I'm not seeing anything yet. Yeah.
Hi, Matt. I'm going to ask a question that you might be able to address now or later. So this is in regards to the different ways that posters are left up at different conferences. For example, at ARO, it's left up for 24 hours. And other conferences, you stay with your poster for the 2 hours you're there. And how would you, what advice or comments do you have about how to organize your poster in a way that is meaningful, not only for when you present it, but also for when you're not there to present it, or for when somebody's going to be there watching it digitally, the way we're going to be doing with ARO.
Yeah, there are a lot of thoughts I have about this. I bet Kelsey has some thoughts on this too. I'll give one quick on my own, and then Kelsey, you might want to pipe in here. The one piece of advice I think is really important for when you're not there at your poster is to annotate your plot so that the audience knows how to interpret it, right? So, and I showed you an example of this before where I had a plot and then I had a little text box that pointed right to a data point that supported an interpretation, right? So I said, when you make a mistake on one word, it leads to mistakes on later words, right? Well, how do you know that? Well, I pointed right at that data point, and I made sure that I had a succinct sentence that explained that result, and I pointed it right to the data plot. One more little thing is, I think you saw just a moment ago, your major points that if you would hit if you just had, like 1 minute, I would set those apart, use contrast, make the text bigger, put it in a box that has a big thick border, and have uniform structure for those things. Have that, let me see if I can call it up real quick. Here's one. So this, I'm just doing this with a little PowerPoint object. It's not the actual poster, but you can see these big green boxes here. These stand out, right? So if I'm just looking at this poster and no one's there to present it, I'm probably looking at what's in those boxes, right? So that's one idea. Kelsey, I wonder if you have other things that come to mind for when you're an ARO veteran, I think.
Yeah. So I guess I do make posters a little differently depending on the conference. I guess depending on the poster format. So if it's the sort of conference where I only have an hour to present it and the poster is only up for an hour, I'm going to make that poster very different. So for that poster, I'm going to cut out a lot of the detail, a lot of the text, and I'm going to do a lot of the things that Matt is talking about, where I have boxes with the main points, and I'm going to include maybe fewer figures, things like that, because I will be there to help people understand the figure, and I can walk through any questions they may have, and I can also tell them details that may not be on the poster. If it's the sort of conference where I put up a poster and it's going to be up for 24 hours, 48 hours, in that case, I do tend to add a little bit more detail in the methods, a little bit more detail. So if I'm not there to explain something, the content is there for the person to read it. So I guess those are subtle changes that I do, but no matter what format it is, I always have, kind of like what Matt said, I always have boxes that have the main point of each thing listed. So
we had another question here about specifically in the online format, what other strategies? And that's kind of similar to the idea of not being there, even if it's an in-person conference. I think for an online format, another thing that I would suggest is having clear landmarks on your poster, because you realize that you can't really point to things, and your mouse cursor might not be visible on another person's screen. So you might have sections that are lettered A, B, C, D, right? And over there in section C, to make sure a person's looking where you want them to look, just to have a tactic to guide their attention could be really useful for that. I'll see if other things come to mind just specifically for online posters. But let's go to this idea of questioning, because this is, I think, cuts across all different formats. I'm going to reshare my screen here. You can see that, and here we go. So I'm going to think about how to stay on track. And the background to this is that people will have different questions that might ask you to jump pretty far away from your story. And you're like, well, I wasn't going to get there yet, or maybe that's not really what you're talking about, but they want to be, they want to be interested. They want to talk about, everyone wants to talk about what they do. So you want to prepare for that. So have your responses ready for those situations. You might think, oh yeah, that is a good point. But in this study that I'm talking about, we're focusing something on something a little different, right? Just to make sure you don't get dragged into a tangent conversation, like someone comes to your poster and then you end up talking about their poster. That happens quite a bit. Or if someone asks you something that you're going to build up to, but you actually want to say, yeah, but let me show you how I got to that point. So there's a delicate balance between doing this versus making sure you don't spend too much of their time. Sometimes they're doing this as a signal to you, like, oh yes, I understand these methods because I use these methods. You don't have to explain them to me, right? So don't just follow a script. You can be responsive to them. But if someone's trying to guess your results and guess what everything means before you really set up your story, it's okay to say, I want to show you how I get to that point. I want to show you my logic and thinking, and then maybe get your opinion on it. You can make a person feel very valued by saying, I want you to know how I'm thinking because I want your input, right? There's sort of a positive spin on how to gauge that interaction. Sometimes one person really can derail it for other visitors. So let's suppose, one person walks up and just wants to keep talking and asking questions about everything, but this person in the background really just wants to hear the poster. So if you notice that, if you have one visitor who's just there and doesn't go away, that's really good because they're interested, but you want to make sure you're not avoiding or ignoring other people. You can say to that visitor, yeah, I want to talk more about that. I want to learn about that. Let me make sure I'm not ignoring these people over here. Okay. And you can look at those other people over there and invite them, right? Say, oh, are you seeing something on this poster that you want me to explain? And probably they're going to say yes, right? Because if they've been patient enough to wait for you, they want to say, yeah, I want to keep, I want to hear your story. And it can be a way of just making sure you use your time to talk to as many people as you want to talk to. And maybe that first person will stay, I've seen this happen, will stay and hear a second tour of the poster just to catch more. Those people are golden. I love them. So, sometimes people just talk and talk and talk, and you want to know how to get someone's attention. We've all been in this situation, right? You can even, if you want to type into the chat, that's fine too. All of us have been in the situation of just wanting someone to talk through the poster with us, but they're just in rapt conversation with someone else. Think about someone in that situation at your poster. How can you prevent that situation? Another thing I want to talk about here, I have just a couple more points to make before turning it back over to Kelsey. Imagine that you're not just going through your poster from beginning to end. You have a few visitors, but you're at the midway point and now someone new walks up. This is not something we usually practice for, but I want to encourage you to literally practice for this. So here's a method that I suggest. You have your full version of your poster. You have your introduction. You talk about the question that drives your work, your method, what you're doing, and what your results are. You get midway through, and then an important professor walks up. Well, because you've practiced your short version, you detour to the short version for that one person. You give them a quick question and the method. You catch them up in 30 seconds or 40 seconds. And that new visitor gets a quick catch up. You return back to your full version. Now, there are two really good things that happen. So this is actually an opportunity. So it's a situation that looks like it would be stressful, but it's a great opportunity in two ways. One, you show this new person how good of a communicator you are. Anyone who can get me like midway through their story in 30 seconds has really good communication skills. If you know how to just get to the right question and tell me everything I need to know to catch me up really quickly, you have a good handle and you're impressing me with how good you are. The other benefit is that for the people who are just stood around and heard the real first half, they only, they have a moment of pause, right? They get a second look at that question just to make sure that they understood it. Right? And that could be really useful too. And maybe in that moment, they think of a question that they want to be clarified, right? So this is actually good for everyone if you can take advantage of it as best you can. So you want to think as you plan your poster, how would you catch up a new visitor at each of those different points? It's easy in the beginning, right? It's really, it's a tricky and challenging situation in the middle, but it can go really well. If you do it well. If you're near the end, you might just tell a person, hang on for a moment as I wrap up with this person here, and I'll be with you in just a minute, right? And so you want to think about what you would say if a new person walks up at each of those different points. While I have this diagram on the screen, if you were to present this poster to your lab or someone who's not working on your project, you present it, and then with the poster in front of you, ask them to give you the poster, right? And so just make sure this is a low stakes environment, but they might present something that has something in common with what you did, but you might find that they missed the real question. They might have focused on something to the side. You might say, well, that's not actually what we did at all. Or you overemphasized the method and didn't get the point. You didn't give the takeaway message. So you can learn from what other people do if they give your poster. And then you realize that, oh, I missed the real question. I overemphasized the method. I need to be clear about this. So it could be a really good way of practicing and then redesigning your narrative based on what other people thought the point was. Okay, so one more thing I want to talk about before wrapping up this section here is the idea of this, somewhat recent style of poster where you have huge text in the middle of the poster and like really tiny text on the side with all the details. So I'm not really a big fan of this. I know that some people are. So I want to make sure that as you're considering this kind of poster, that you don't do it merely to avoid practicing good, skillful communication. This is a bit of a shortcut to make sure people get the takeaway message, and it's good that they get the takeaway message, right? But you want to use your poster to also demonstrate your communicative skills and demonstrate how you think about your project. You might lose some interpersonal interaction because a person might walk by, read the big text on your poster and just keep walking, right? Because they got the point. What else is there? It doesn't really invite me to take part of the scientific thinking process. So I want to know, how did you arrive at that conclusion? I look at your methods. I want to make sure that I agree with how your logic works. I want to see your decision-making process. I want to give some critical feedback. I want critical feedback if I'm giving a poster. So these are all things that aren't really easy to access if you minimize all those details on the side and only focus on the takeaway message. So I think the motivation behind this kind of poster it comes from the right place, which is that people are sometimes not very good at making their takeaway point clear. There's a good middle ground to be had, which is like learn good communication skills, learn good design skills, plan and seek out good resources. And then a person will be able to get your takeaway point, even if you didn't resort to this kind of slide design. In other words, use your poster to show someone how you think, teach them something about you and not just about your study. Occasionally you do want to simplify the point, but this is pretty rare that you have one sentence as a takeaway. So to recap these poster tips before I hand it back off to Kelsey, plan your narrative before you plan your design. Avoid both walls of text and walls of figures because it's more inviting if I see a little bit of varied structure. Put landmarks on there both for yourself and for someone else if you're not there. Make sure your greeting will allow someone to seek what they want. Pause after your main ideas to let the person form a question. Have different versions. Have the full version, have quick versions, and you can use those quick versions to catch people up at various points during your presentation. Plan for those questions and how you respond if those questions would throw you off your rhythm. Know how to put questions off until later. Know how to say, I have an answer for that, but let me arrive at that answer through the poster rather than letting the person dictate your sequence. And as always, think of ways to reduce effort for the audience as they're reading your presentation. All right, I'm going to stop sharing so Kelsey can take over.
Okay, so it looks like we do have one really good question in the comment or in the chat. So it's from Samantha, and she says, what are your thoughts on providing QR codes on posters and paper? Is there a good equivalent for virtual posters to be able to get your poster or visit your lab website? Matt, do you have any good thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've used QR codes pretty often. I find them to be pretty useful. They're very easy. You can find websites that are free QR code generators. Let's see, let me make sure I understand the question. Is a good equivalent for virtual posters? For virtual posters, you can still put a QR code on there. You might also have the ability to have active hyperlinks as well. So I think I think phones can still, like read something even if it's on a screen. I think so.
Yeah, I think QR codes are great, and I think they do work on the screen, so you could still put them on your poster. If that doesn't work, I would recommend putting the website or whatever it is that you want to lead them to, maybe in the title part or on the bottom of your poster, whatever you're sharing when you're presenting. Because often if you put it in the chat, then everyone new who comes onto the Zoom at least, they're not going to see everything before that. So that's what I would do in that case.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Thanks, Matt. I think I will take over now. Okay. All right. So far, Matt and I have talked about a lot of different ways for putting together successful talks and successful posters and successful figure design. Now, for the very last part of this workshop, I want to focus on another but equally important consideration as you start to put together your presentation for the upcoming meeting. And that is, I want you to think about creating and presenting information that is accessible and inclusive for everyone attending your talk or your poster. So if we go back to kind of the basics of what does it mean to have good science communication? Well, that means making sure that your audience understands your message. And it's so important to keep in mind that that really includes everyone, because your audience will be diverse. They will come from different backgrounds. They might experience the world in a slightly different way than you do. And so it's really important to be cognizant that the way that you present and what you include in your presentation, you want to make sure that you're making it so that it's accessible and inclusive, particularly for people with disabilities. And so disability can be a lot of different things and come in many different forms. It can be auditory, visual, physical, it can even be situational. And so because of this, people with disabilities often have a wide array of experiences. And so it's so important to keep this in mind as you put your presentations together. And I also want to point out that because people do have a lot of different experiences, there's not one perfect way to be perfectly accessible and inclusive for every single person. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to walk through 5 tips that you can consider and incorporate that will go a long way with being as inclusive and accessible as you can with everyone who attends your poster or your talk in a couple of weeks. Okay, so the tips I'm going to go over today come from a few different sources. So there's a lot of great online resources. I have a few here that are particularly great for thinking about accessible data visualization. There are also some really great online tools that you can check out, and I'll talk about all of these a little bit more in a couple of minutes. And I also want to say that some of these ideas came about through some great conversations with Brad Baran, who is on ARO's very own accessibility committee, which was just recently formed, and they're doing really, really great work with trying to make ARO even more accessible than it already is. And don't worry, you don't have to worry about taking screenshots or writing down all of these links. We will definitely share all of these resources and everything that we've talked about today after the workshop. So don't worry too much about that. Okay, so as I said, disability encompasses many different things, but today what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on strategies that will be particularly helpful for those with hearing and or vision difficulties. And so right here, I want to kind of highlight something that's really unique and special about ARO, and that is ARO has maybe one of the largest groups of hearing scientists, researchers, clinicians who have hearing loss, who are deaf and hard of hearing. And so this is such a great group of people who are a part of ARO. And recently, they've, myself included, we've published this really awesome paper where we talk about some ways that you can promote equity and inclusion of deaf and hard of hearing individuals in professional organizations. So if you're interested in learning more about that, I really encourage you to check out this paper that was just published. Okay, so now I've been throwing around a couple different terms like accessible or inclusive. And so what do I mean by these words? So let's start with the first one. What does it mean to be accessible? At a very fundamental level, being accessible means having access to information. So let's say, for example, you have someone who is maybe deaf or hard of hearing, and they're facing someone who may be talking to them, and they might not have any idea what they're saying because they have no access to that auditory information. And that can be because maybe the other person is wearing a mask, or maybe their camera is off for Zoom. There is nothing there that the other person can work with. And so to make this particular scenario more accessible, by providing captioning, for example, you have now allowed this person access to the information with what you're saying. Okay, so what does it mean to be inclusive then? Inclusive is similar but slightly different. So let's say that you are giving a talk and you have, audience members. And to be inclusive means that you make intentional design choices that make it easier for your audience to understand what you're trying to convey to them. That can be a lot of different things. For instance, maybe the text that you're using or the color choices that you use, your audience members may be able to see them, but it might be very hard for them to distinguish between different groups or to read the text in the first place. And so to make this more inclusive, there are subtle changes that you can do with the text or your word choices that are more inclusive for your audience members. Okay, so now I'm going to step through 5 tips that will be really helpful for those who are deaf or hard of hearing or with visual difficulties. So my first tip is to try to be redundant in how you present your information. What do I mean by that? Well, so for example, let's say you're giving a talk or you're presenting a poster and you say, I presented 4 or 12 hertz amplitude modulation AM. Now, let's say on the slide or your poster, you just have the text. You have the text that says 4 or 12 hertz AM. And maybe you have someone who is not familiar with this stimuli. Maybe you have someone who is deaf and hard of hearing. And this is especially important for if you're giving a talk and you play the audio clip of the stimuli that you present. That is, if you can't hear the stimuli that you're presenting, then that's not very helpful for that person. So to be redundant in this case is to also visualize the audio stimuli. So in this case, instead of just putting 4 or 12 hertz AM text only, I would have the text, but also a visual representation of that text. So even if the person does not have access to the auditory stimuli, or maybe they don't know what the stimulus is, at least there's a visual kind of conceptual representation of what the stimuli are. And this is very helpful. And I think this is great for both talks and posters. I also encourage you to kind of be redundant throughout your presentation. So maybe you visualize the stimuli and when you were describing the methods, but now that you're showing actual data, it's great to try to be redundant there as well. And here I have an example of a psychometric function. And on the x-axis, I have the different amplitude modulation rates. So in addition to just having the text labels, it's also really helpful to have those rates visualized as well. And this is, again, an example of being redundant, and it really helps your viewer if they can't see as well or hear as well, they'll be able to interpret the data that you show them. Another way to be redundant is to use essential labels and text to understand the figure without having to rely 100% on what you're saying. This is especially helpful for those of us with hearing loss. So this is an example that Matt showed a little bit earlier, but I think it's great because it demonstrates what I'm saying here. So for example, if you're going to walk through the timing of a trial structure in an experiment, not only do you have the audio stimuli visualized, you also have an important label to point out what that is. And kind of similar to what I talked about in the beginning of the workshop where you step through, show one thing at a time. Here I have the stimuli visualized, but I also have the label to help and so forth. Okay. Another way to be redundant, and this is particularly helpful for those who might have some vision difficulties, I really urge you to try to use different line textures or shapes for each condition or group that you're showing. Here's an example figure where I have 2 different groups. I have a hearing loss group and a control group. And it's not terrible, but it's a little hard to distinguish, especially if you have not great vision. there are a couple of things that you can do to improve this figure. Like I said, using different line textures goes a long way. So what I did here is I made the line thickness a lot thicker. And to compare the two groups, I have a solid line and a dotted line. And in addition, kind of again being redundant, is I use two different shapes for each of the two groups. So I have a circle and a triangle. If I go back to what it looked like before, that's a much better improvement. The colors are, I'm sorry, the two groups are more easily distinguishable. What's even better, and what Matt touched on, is it is helpful to have the labels next to the data that it represents. And again, you want to reduce the effort that your audience has to do in order to interpret your data. Okay. My second tip is to slow down and pause after important points. This allows for time to process what you are saying. And this is really helpful for those who have hearing loss or hearing difficulties, or maybe some difficulties with auditory processing. So to kind of demonstrate what often happens is there are so many talks I've been to, and I'm sure you all have been to, where you're listening to the speaker and they talk a million miles an hour and they have no pauses, and then they go on to the next slide. This is really difficult. So in this case, the example is, I recorded auditory brainstem responses to see whether there are changes to thresholds, next slide. And then the person is off to the next thing. And then your audience is still trying to process what they said before. So really trying to slow down and pause after important points. In this particular example, a better way to do this would be to say, I recorded auditory brainstem responses, pause, to see whether there were changes to thresholds, pause. Now you've given your audience time to process what you're saying and allow them to really get the main point of what you're trying to say. So this really goes a long way. And one thing I want to say on this point is that all too often, you'll practice your talk a certain way, and then once you get on stage or when you're actually giving your talk, it's so easy to talk really, really fast because you're nervous or something like that. So one way around that is I really urge you to try to, when you practice your presentation, really try to slow yourself down and actively think about it. And also actively think about where you would insert your pauses. So if you have an important point to make, actively think about, okay, I'm going to pause after this point, then I'm going to move on to the next thing. So if you practice that way, then you're more likely to also replicate it when you actually give your talk. Another reason why this is beneficial is that slowing down really allows for automatic captioning time to align with what you're saying. All too often, if you have somebody who is relying 100% or mostly on the automatic captioning and you're talking too quickly, the captioning ultimately just jumps around trying to catch up. And so what the person is left with is just a lot of words that kind of make sense, but not really. So they're going to have a lot harder time following along if you're talking too quickly. My third tip is I would choose your color palettes carefully. And so this is being cognizant that there are those out there with color blindness and or vision loss. And there are different types of color blindness. And I think, usually when we think of color blindness, we think of just red or green color blindness, but there are different types, and it's important to be mindful of that. Here's some examples of the different types of color blindness. So we have deuteranopia, protanopia, tritanopia. These are different types of color blindness where one may not be able to distinguish reds from greens, or maybe the reds and yellows might be kind of similar and the blues and greens might be kind of similar. So it's important to keep this in mind as you make your color choices and your figures. One way to really see how it can be difficult if you have color blindness in interpreting figures is this example here. So I have the example that I showed previously. So on the left side, if you have full color vision, the two colors I have are red and green. And on the right side, I have the same figure, but I'm looking at it through the Protanopia color blindness filter. And here you can see that it's really hard to distinguish between the two colors. And especially by not changing the color shapes or the line texture, it's nearly impossible to tell the difference between the two groups. Again, if you look at green color blindness, for example, it's the same kind of problem. So what can you do? Okay, so I'm not saying that you should avoid red or green altogether, but making small changes to these colors can really go a long way. So for example, on the left side, I have pure red, pure green, and on the bottom here, I have two different types of color blindness. And in this particular example, it's really hard to distinguish between the red and the green. However, if you shift the red a little bit to be more orangish or darker, and you shift the green color to be a little bit more bluish, that can go a long way in being able to make them distinctly different for someone who may have color blindness. There are lots of examples of accessible color palettes, and this particular website here has some examples for you. And these are some examples for colors that are colorblind friendly. So they're highly contrastable between the two, depending on the type of color blindness. And again, I'll share all of these links after the workshop, so you'll have access to that as well. There are so many really awesome online tools, and I really encourage you to check them out and to play around with them. They're a lot of fun to check out. So one of my favorite ones is coolers.co, and this website is great. You can create your own color palettes, you can choose from existing color palettes, and the coolest thing about this website is that you can view these color palettes through different colorblind filters. So in this particular example, I have the color palette I'm interested in the top panel, and on the bottom panel, I have the same colors, but viewed through the Protanopia color filter. So if I zoom in on that, what you do is you have the color blindness thing that you can choose between, and you can select between all of these different types, and you can see how the colors change for each filter. It's a lot of fun and really, really cool. And it's a great way to make sure that the color choices that you're making are inclusive and accessible ones. Another really cool one that I really encourage you to check out is this website with the color blindness simulator called Coblis. And what you can do is you can upload an existing figure that you have, and you can view it through different colorblind filters. So to kind of walk you through. So this is a screenshot of that website, and I've uploaded the previous figure example that I just showed you. And this is the one where I used the red and the green. So here you can see that I'm using the red blind color filter, and it's really hard to tell the difference between the two. One thing I want to point out is here's the figure where the new and improved figure where we use different line thicknesses and different colors. If I upload this figure, it's much improved, right? So not only can you distinguish between the two colors using when you have color blindness, you can also see how using thicker line widths or different textures or different shapes can really, really be helpful with increasing contrast between the two groups. Speaking of contrast, my tip 4 is try to incorporate high contrast elements. And You can do this in a couple of different ways, but one very effective way is with color. So here's an example here on the left where the colors that are used are they're highly contrasted with the white background. Or if you want to have white text on a color, the contrast there is very high. On the right side, the color contrast between the background and the foreground is a little bit more muddy, so it's a little harder to distinguish between the two. Another really great way to increase contrast is to add a white border around your data elements. So here's an example of that. So here on the left side, we have data points where they kind of mesh together. It's really hard to distinguish between the data points. But if you add a white border, you can easily see the individual data points. So that goes a long way with being able to tell data points apart from each other, especially if they're overlapping like this. White borders are also effective in certain types of plots. So here we have a plot on the left side without a border, and it's really hard to distinguish between the different colored segments. But if you add a white border, it's now much more easy to see the differences between the color segments because you've increased the contrast using that border. My very last tip is to increase the clarity of your text and data. And there's some really simple ways that you can do this. I would aim for larger text and data points. Okay, so here's an example of why that is important. So here is an example where I have 2 words, design, well, I guess 1 word, but replicated 2 times. We have design, 1 larger, 1 smaller. So if you think about someone who may have reduced visual clarity, if they're looking at this, these 2 words, one is obviously a little easier to see than the other. And that one is the one with the larger text. So when possible, try to use larger text in your posters or your presentations or your figures. And I've already talked about this, but this does increase the clarity of your text and data. Use distinctive data point and shapes, either with line texture, line thickness, or with shape variability. Another point that I want to make here is that the shapes that you select are also important. So the X's compared to a circle, those are highly contrasting. Whereas if you use maybe a circle and a square, those are different shapes, but they're maybe not as contrasting as they could be. Another point I want to make is that type font that you use also matters. And I would encourage you to use sans serif font. So what is that? Okay, so here I have the 1 word design replicated in many different ways. So the top row, that is what we would call a serif font. So those are your Times New Roman, things like that. So what that means is that at the ends of each letter, there are these kind of ornamental or decorative points, you know, curly cues or dashes. Those kind of make it more scripty, I guess. The middle row is what I would say is a sans serif. So that is your Arial, Helvetica. Those are the ones where it's more blocky. At the ends of each letters, there are no kind of curly cues or anything like that. And on the bottom row, you have your decorative fonts, you know, very hard to read, kind of cursive like. Okay, so why does this matter? So if you look at this through reduced visual clarity, I think that you can appreciate that some are a little bit more clear than others. The one that is conveyed the best through reduced visual clarity is if you have the sans serif that is a larger text font. So that is why it's really important to kind of strive for larger text and strive for the specific type of font. Okay, so kind of wrapping up here, you know, ARO just announced recently that they're shifting from in-person to virtual only. And there are a couple of things I want to really have you keep in mind as you present virtually. It's really important that you do enable your automatic captioning. This is going to be so important for those of us with hearing loss. And as I mentioned earlier, ARO is amazing because we have so many awesome scientists and researchers who have hearing loss. And we want to make sure that we're being as inclusive and accessible for everyone as possible. So please make sure that your automatic captioning is enabled when you're presenting your poster or your talk. Through Zoom, it depends. So with Zoom, it depends on the type of Zoom account that you have. But if you have a university account, something like that, you should be able to have this live transcript on the bottom of your screen. And the one that you want is to enable auto transcription. So if you select that, then if someone wants the captioning, they can enable it if they need it. Google Meet is another way to present your posters. Google Meet is great because it doesn't matter what type of account you have, they provide captioning for everyone. So similar to Zoom, there's the turn on captions button on the bottom part. Another thing that's really important, especially for those of us who have hearing loss, it's so important to have a clear view of your face because this is very helpful for lip reading in particular. So if you're presenting your poster, I really encourage you to make sure that number one, your camera is on. That is very important. And number two, make sure the lighting is good. Make sure your face is in full view. I would really discourage poor lighting because, what's the point if, your audience can't see your face for lip reading or general access to visual cues. And another thing to keep in mind is that make sure your audio has good quality. And this is important for not only being able to listen to what you're saying effectively, but also the quality of the live captioning, because the captioning is only as good as the audio quality that it's working with. And my final thing is use the chat feature to ask and answer questions if needed. So if you're having a hard time understanding what the person is asking or vice versa, feel free to say, oh, why don't you ask your question in the chat, or I'll answer using the chat. Feel free to use the chat feature to your advantage and to help the people who are trying to listen to you as well. Okay, so now I'm going to end the show and let Matt take over for the final bit of the workshop.
Okay, here we are. All right, so we have just a little bit of time left. And so what we want to do is just go through a little bit more rapid fire, just a bunch of takeaway points that might be useful for people attending with us here. So one thing I always encourage anyone who's practicing their presentation and it's a talk, put slide numbers in your talk before you practice it. You'll get better feedback that way because people might say, on slide 11, you had this thing, right? Instead of somewhere in the introduction, there was something blue on the screen. I don't really remember. Like, you get a lot more precise and better feedback. Plus, as someone is taking notes on your talk, they can take notes with the slide number right next to it. Also, when you're practicing, my way of practicing is to practice slide 1, then practice slide 1 and 2, then practice slide 1, 2, and 3, then practice slide 1, 2, 3, and 4, rather than going all the way through, because your early slides, your introduction will get really smooth as you do this, and you'll learn exactly how you want to say something in an efficient way. Remember that your narrative is about your actual scientific message, the question you're trying to solve, your goals, but not about the different conditions or exactly what study preceded it or your stimuli or statistics. Those might be the things you spent the most time on and which you want to get recognition for, but they might not be what the audience needs. Write the takeaway points first, then order your slide structure, and turn those points into your titles. Make your titles do work for you. The title should be the main point of your slide. The slide is for the audience, not for you. As Kelsey was saying before, sometimes people use slides just as note cards for themselves. as if they're little points that remind them, oh yeah, that's right, I have to talk about that thing, but it's not really informative for the audience. When you're citing work, make sure you emphasize the knowledge that you got from those papers, but don't just cite things just to show people that you've done the reading. Whenever you're giving a point, learn how to make it efficient, learn how to give the quickest version of every point. As Kelsey said, don't use a laser pointer. No one that I've ever met has ever been good at controlling a laser pointer. Instead, use the tips that are available in your software. Circle something, use arrows to point at something. It's going to be a lot easier for people to know what to look at. Plus, you might not even have access to a laser pointer. So tips for data plots: x-axis, then y-axis, one data point, then the whole data pattern. For most plots, that's a really good investment of time. Show some example data, even if it's fake. It could be a very clean pattern, just to say, if the results went this way, here's how the data would look. If the results went the other way, here's how the data would look. That way, a person knows how to interpret the patterns before getting into all the messiness of what real data look like. Show a little data first, make sure people understand it, then show the rest of the data. Highlight the important parts. Make sure I know where to look as I'm looking at your plot. And whenever you can, directly label the data rather than asking me to look back and forth toward a legend. If you're using a bar plot, make sure the bottom of the bar plot is at 0 or the lowest anchor point of your scale. If you don't do this, people might have skepticism as to whether you're trying to mislead them or trying to magnify things, because bar plots, what they show you is the proportional difference between the bottom of the plot and the top of your data point. That's what they show, that distance. If you just need to zoom in on a small difference, you can use point plots or box plots or something else, but not bars, because they should originate at 0. If you're using color, be consistent, use it intuitively, use it accessibly and inclusively, as Kelsey was just saying. Eliminate data that you're not going to discuss. If it's on the screen, people will look at it and wonder why it's on the screen. So if you're not going to talk about it, either make it less visible by dimming it out or eliminate it altogether. There are really good tips online. I've talked about storytelling with data. Echo Rivera is another person who's active online and has tutorials and a consultation service that are really good to use. Those tools are out there, and seek them out. Some good habits to avoid: just creating things that are notes to yourself. Make sure it's for the audience. Avoid using acronyms or abbreviations. People don't remember them. They save space, but at the cost of understanding. Don't show a plot just because it's the one from a paper. Make the plot tell the point that you need to convey. And definitely don't show a figure from a paper just to prove that you read the paper. People do that all the time. Order your axis in a way that's helpful. If you just have categories, you can put the categories in the order of performance or in the order of something else that's useful for you. If you're showing data, try, if you can, to avoid saying things like, so obviously, as you can see here. It's probably not obvious to a lot of people in the audience. And if there's even one person in the audience for whom it's not obvious, they can feel a little left out of the conversation. Along those lines, you want your goal to be not to impress people with how smart you are, but impress them with how smart they are. And if they think that they're missing something, they're not going to enjoy that experience. Don't withhold information just to make a splash later. Don't make it a mystery novel. You probably will lose people along the way in pursuit of that. And finally, don't end with, so that's all I got. You want to have an actual ending for your talk. Here's what you can do to end the talk effectively. What people usually do is something like this. They put pictures of their lab, they put their university logo, they have a slide that just says the word questions, pictures of a child or pictures of a dog. These are all fun, but they don't actually facilitate the interaction you want at the end of a talk. What you want is for people to remember your takeaway points and know how to contact you. If you leave up the takeaway points at the end of your presentation, they can mull over them, they can think back, they can consolidate, they can ask questions. It might remind them of questions they wanted to ask you. If they're not comfortable speaking aloud, your contact info could be really important. They might not want to go up to the microphone and ask you something, but they still want to know how to get in touch with you to talk about your work. Here's an example of a final slide that I put on a recent talk. I had a quick rundown of my takeaway points. Usually I'll have as many as just 3. In this case, I had 4 because I was ambitious, but 3 takeaway points, my contact info. And so with that, I'll leave up some of our takeaway points, how to contact Kelsey, how to contact me, and some things that we want you to remember from this presentation. I think we have a couple minutes to address some questions, so I'm going to leave this up, but call up my chat window, and Kelsey and I might be able to address some extra thoughts that you all have.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Kelsey and Matt. On behalf of people think about the questions that they want to ask and put in the chat, I want to take this time on behalf of myself and Dana and spARO to thank Kelsey and Matt for the wonderful presentation they just gave us. We have allotted for 2 hours for this presentation, so we have a couple of minutes for questions. Before we turn into questions, I wanted to point out several things. Number one, this presentation is being recorded, and that's for the benefits of you. And so this will be accessible later on afterwards. I think either tomorrow or in a few days. So if you want to go back and tell other people about it, they can look at it. We will also send to your emails, those who have registered, some of the information that was presented here today as well, some of the links. And with that, we will also send a survey for you to fill out, and I will also post it here on the chat. This survey allows us to really think about what you like, what we can improve upon, and what was good, so that in later years we can take this information. And so if you want to put your questions in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, turn on your camera and speak directly to Matt and Kelsey, they'll be able to answer your questions. I'm not sure how much time they have, but they can let us know how much they're willing to ask, or you could contact them directly after.
Yeah, I'm willing to hang around and answer, address some questions. I think Allie Coffin had something that she wanted to chime in with as well. Allie, maybe you want to unmute there? Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Matt and Kelsey, very much. And hello, everybody. Just a couple of quick previews of upcoming so far in-person conferences. One, for any of you that are really interested in continuing to up your game in science communication. In addition to being a hearing researcher, I'm also the president of Science Talk, which is a professional society for science communicators. And our upcoming conference is March 23rd through 25th in Portland, Oregon, and available virtually. So we are planning a hybrid conference. Right now, I think we're hopefully going to be in the dip following Omicron. So everybody come to Portland. We can hang out there. I posted a link in the chat to that conference, and we still do have travel and registration awards available as well. Also, for all the auditory people, all of us, I'm also the vice chair of the upcoming Gordon Research Conference in the auditory system, which is July in Rhode Island. So I posted the link to that conference in the chat as well. If you haven't been to a Gordon conference, I really recommend it. These are small conferences where we all stay in the dorms together, we eat all our meals together, we hang out together, we play capture the flag at night, and it's a chance to walk up to anyone in the field at the conference and just sit down over lunch and say hi. I, to a degree, owe my faculty job to a hike at a Gordon conference, not even to a session itself. Really recommend it. And since we can't get together in person now, let's plan on getting together in person in July, and I think we can do it. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Allie. I also want to thank the organizers for letting us do this for a second year in a row. And yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not seeing a whole lot in the chat. So, but you have, you can contact Allie, who just spoke. You can contact Kelsey or myself. Our contact information is up there. And of course, we are not by any means the only sources of advice and tips on this topic. There's a wealth of information online that you can seek out as well.